to start with the presentation of John Beverly and the Department of Spanish of Portuguese gave me the opportunity to make the presentation. His introduction, sorry. For me, it's a huge honor to introduce my former professor and advisor at University of Pittsburgh, where I achieved my master and PhD degrees during the early 90s. As a student, I benefited from these two specialties and passions. I took courses on the Spanish Renaissance and Baroque. I also attended his courses on Latin American testimonial, film, subaltern, and post-colonial studies. He has published 7 books, around 100 articles, and edited other 7 books. But instead of going into the details of his academic achievements, you can find those using any search engine. I would like to talk a little bit about his human side. He welcomed the group of Peruvians that arrived to the city of Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. Most of them were political and economic refugees who were fleeing Peru. In this Andean country, the worst part of a civil war or a low-intensity war, according to the Department of the State, took place from 1980 to 1995. As a refugee, I immediately felt the empathy he had for us. His understanding of our culture was impressive. He was in most of our social events, eating Peruvian cuisine and listening to our music. Among the Peruvians, we could not explain how an American professor could know so much about us. Later, we found that John Beverly had lived for 7 years during his childhood in Lima. And of course, he has read everything about us in his adulthood. John is a committed intellectual. He has belonged to several solidarity movements with the Third World, and he has connections with unions in the deindustrialized Pittsburgh. As a student, I saw him in different meetings and marches in Pittsburgh and Washington, D.C. This political participation is something that his students have emulated and continued throughout the years. He's also an excellent and generous advisor. He has helped us in our daily lives and academically at Pitt. We got temporary jobs thanks to his recommendations and lived in his house during the summers while he was traveling with Gail, his wife, and Alisa, his daughter. I remember very well his condition to stay in the house. Eat everything within the refrigerator and do not enter my office, which was unlocked. I learned a lot in the long conversations with him. Like many graduate students, I spent the summer of 1999 at his home with my new wife. This summer was very productive. I finished the first draft of my dissertation, and I got my first real job in the US. We can see the results of his good advising in the placements of his advisees and the contributions they have made in both the Latin American and Peninsular Studies fields. He has directed 45 dissertations. To my knowledge, several of his former advisees are working at third-rank universities in Bolivia, Chile, France, Peru, Spain, US, and Venezuela. To finish this introduction, I want to give thanks to the Department of Spanish and Portuguese and the Center for Latin American Studies in making John Beverly's visit to to Ohio State postdoc. The invitation grew out of the discussion of Góngора's poetry and other topics in a graduate course taught by Elizabeth Davis and Lisa Bott. Welcome to John Beverly.
Thank you, Juan. I'm going to speak from here. Is that okay? Can everybody hear me okay? So I'm going to be referring in my talk to two passages, one from a text by Gayatri Spivak and one from a text by Álvaro García Guerrera. So I passed out, I'll read the passages, but just for a double check, I passed out, I don't think enough copies, but after that very nice and warm introduction, I'm embarrassed maybe in a way to say that I think my talk is a little bit on the dry side. Somebody, when I was just began my graduate studies in this one, said I was interested in kind of the intersection between politics and literature. Somebody said, why aren't you in political science? Because it seemed to be, I talk a lot more about politics than I talk about literature, and I'm afraid that's going to be a little bit the case today. So my apologies in advance. What I'm going to, the talk I'm going to give today, The Subaltern in the State, is part of a book of mine that just came out. I'll pass this around. It's for Juan, so make sure that it doesn't disappear somewhere along the way. So you know the copy I have at the moment. Literally, it just came out. So, but if you're interested in these thoughts and you're inspired to get the book, it's I think now available on Amazon. So I had just for the record, for the historical record. I'm going to be talking a little bit about the project of subaltern studies in Latin America. This project that begins as a South Asian project of South Asian historians, but then gets picked up in the early 1990s by mainly people in the literature field, literature and cultural studies field in Latin America, and then becomes a sort of event, I guess you could call it, in Latin American studies in the 1990s. I was, because when I went to my hotel this morning, I realized, I know this place, the University Plaza Inn. This is where we had the second meeting of the Latin American Subaltern Studies Group in, I think, if memory serves me well, 1994. And of course, very central in that second meeting. So Ohio State and Latin American Subaltern Studies are very closely bound up. You're very closely bound up, of course, in the fact that one of the co-organizer of the group, along with me, was Ileana Rodriguez. And I had hoped that, I had expected, in fact, in setting up these remarks today, that they would take the form of a dialogue with Ileana, but unfortunately Ileana is now in Chile for a week, so that's not going to work. So, but I hope, in any case, that there's material here for discussion. I'll try to keep it as short as possible, because I think really maybe some of the things we'll get into in the discussion will be more interesting than what I have to say, which is, again, I think a little too maybe abstract. Even though Ileana's not here, I'm going to start with her. Some years ago, Ileana posed quite bluntly, I think, but accurately, what she thought was at stake in the project of subaltern studies, Latin American subaltern studies, as follows. Now I'm quoting Ileana. Our choice as intellectuals is to make a declaration either in support of statism, the nation state and party politics, or on behalf of the subaltern. We choose the subaltern. I'm going to argue today that this way of looking at the relation between the subaltern and the state, which is broadly characteristic, I think, of postmodernist social theory generally, is too one-sided and that we are in need of a new paradigm. That paradigm would be post-subalternist in the sense that it seeks to displace the subalternist paradigm. The subalternist paradigm represented by being on the sense of a choice, either in favor of the nation or in favor of the subaltern. But also in the sense that it's a consequence of the subalternist paradigm, in that it involves rethinking the nature of the nation state and hegemony from the perspectives opened up by subaltern studies. Post-subaltern, sometimes in the way that Ernesto Laclau talks about somebody being post-Marxist. In other words, what kind of Marxist are you? You're a post-Marxist. So what kind of subaltern is you? Post-subaltern, something like that. To be more concrete, though, what happens to the subalternist paradigm when, as has been the case in recent years in Latin America, subaltern or subaltern-popular movements originating well outside the parameters of the state, the Latin American lettered city, and formal politics, including the traditional politics of the parties of the left, have, to borrow a phrase again from Ernesto Laclau, become the state. For example, the Cocarero movement in Bolivia has become the state. The Cocarero is clearly subaltern, a movement of subaltern. Now, Representative Diego Morales, to begin with, the president of Bolivia, have become the state. Laclau wants to use that idea of becoming the state to distinguish it. It's an idea he gets from Gramsci, from the older concept of, Leninist concept of seizing the state or taking state power, becoming, social movements becoming the state. I have in mind here, of course, the phenomenon of the so-called Marea Rosada, or pink tide, in Latin America. That is the fact that today, almost a quarter century after the collapse of the Soviet Union and the regimes of what used to be called actually existing socialism, and the transition in Latin America of Cuba to what is called an emergency special period, a majority of the population of Latin America lives under governments that describe themselves as socialist or of the left to some extent or another. What's meant exactly by socialism in these cases, for example, in Hugo Chavez's idea of a 21st century socialism, has been subject to much and necessary debate. But of course, it's useful to remember in thinking that there is a debate about are these really socialist or not, that was also a debate about communism and European social democracy. Postmodernism means not only the defeat of the left in Latin America as elsewhere, although it was certain that. Postmodernism, however, was also an occasion for the left to redefine and reinvent itself. One of the consequences, I'm going to be arguing, of that reinvention and redefinition are, in some ways, the pink tide governments in Latin America, which involve not only the reappearance of the left after a long period of conservative restoration in the region, but also its transformation into something quite different than it was in the 60s and 70s. Do the governments of the pink tide in Latin America herald a more general and deeper radicalization? Or are they faced by their own self-imposed reformism and willingness to work within the framework of globalization to a kind of Latin American capitalism with a human face and now a multicultural face? My friend Jose Rabasa, also a member of the Subaltern Studies group and also one of the people who was here at Ohio State in 1994, argues, and now quoting him, it makes little sense to beg the question of a new kind of state, kind, benevolent, democratic, when the state cannot be conceived outside its role of protecting and administering capital whether in the mode of safeguarding international finance or in the mode of a socialist administration of capital. My outlook is, as you'll see, somewhat more hopeful, but this is again for discussion. Whatever its eventual outcome, however, the eventual outcome of the pink tide, the phenomenon undoubtedly has the character of what the French philosopher Alain Badiou calls an event. It is something unexpected, unpredicted, radically contingent and overdetermined, but which in that very contingency and overdetermination, who could have expected 25 years after the total defeat of the left in Latin America, that now a majority of the population of Latin America would be governed by left-wing governments of one sort or another. But which in that very contingency and overdetermination and unexpectedness opens up new, also unforeseen and unforeseeable series of possibilities and determinations. That's then, pink tide is the context in which I want to raise the question of how we think about the question of hegemony and the state today, and not only theoretically, but also as a question of how we orient our own work and commitments as teachers and scholars. And students. It would not be exaggerating too much, I think, to say that the collapse of communism was itself part of a more general loss of confidence in the efficacy of the state to order human life, that it also affected political thinking in the capitalist world. Maybe that's one of the things we mean by postmodernism, collapse in the confidence of the state to order life. The most consequential expression of that loss of belief in the state was, of course, the rise to hegemony of neoliberalism. But it could also be said to have had left-wing forms. It would be enough to mention the names of Foucault and Deleuze in this regard. Among these forms of left, what I'll call left postmodernism, would be the project of subaltern studies itself. Postmodernist social thought privileges the activity of so-called social movements or new social movements functioning outside the parameters of the state and formal politics. The space or territoriality of that activity is sometimes said to be civil society. Sometimes the idea, as in subaltern studies, of civil society itself is problematized as a modern and colonial construct. More recently, as probably most of you are aware, the idea of the trans or post-national has gained currency. For example, in Hart and Negri's influential 2000 book, Empire, which I'll come back to later. In subaltern studies in particular, and I'm thinking of subaltern studies here as one of the forms of postmodernist social thought, the subaltern itself is conceptualized as that which is not only outside the state, but also constitutively opposed to the state in some sense or another. The subaltern is prior to the state or below this level of the state. The transnational, as envisioned by Hart and Negri, is after or beyond the state. If hegemony is understood, to recall Gramsci's famous definition, as the moral and intellectual leadership of the nation, that is, as a power, essentially a cultural power, and an ethical and cultural power, that both interpolates the state and emanates from the state, then the subaltern must be, by definition, a supplement or remainder that is left out of or that escapes from any possible hegemonic articulation. That's at least the paradigm, that's what I'm calling the subaltern paradigm. Gareth Williams makes the point as follows, quoting, "What deconstruction wants is precisely to interrupt the constitution of hegemony, which is not that of the subaltern, in the name of a politics that is different than the relation hegemony, subalternity, constructed with the sole purpose of subordination. But is it inevitable that hegemony involves subordination? The subalternity hegemony distinction, as Williams articulates it here, and as I think it would be fair to say generally is the case in postmodernist theory, seems to involve a confusion between what Gramsci understood as hegemony, that is leadership, and leadership as a discursively elaborated form of consensus that can bring together heterogeneous social or class components into what Gramsci called a historical bloc. A confusion between that sense of hegemony, which is a loose sense of hegemony, and a sense of hegemony that's more bound up with a power to persuade and articulate together heterogeneous elements. And the more ordinary language sense of hegemony as domination or subordination in the sense of the coercive imposition over others of the perspective of a particular class, group, or nation. As in, for example, the familiar phrase, U.S. hegemony. More precisely, it seems to me, the distinction of subalternity and hegemony that underlies the postmodernist paradigm confuses the form of hegemony, moral and intellectual leadership, with its content. Both socialist feminism and fascism are forms of hegemonic articulation, but obviously with quite different consequences for everyday people. That's what I mean by the form content. I don't mean to minimize the distance that separates subalternity and the state. And in addition to the state, the sphere of formal politics, parties, parliament, trade unions, and so forth. Because it's precisely in the space created by that distance that older forms of left politics have deteriorated or disintegrated, and that new forms of left politics can emerge. The need for criticism of authoritarian statism, including especially the case of the Soviet Union and the Soviet bloc, and the states that emerged from anti-colonial struggles, was one of the driving forces behind the emergence of subaltern studies. It's no accident that subaltern studies appears in the Latin American field in any case on the heels of the collapse of the Soviet Union in 1989, 1991, and the defeat of the Sandinista regime, the electoral defeat of the Sandinista regime in 1990 in Nicaragua. But there's a danger that the critique of the state and hegemony may produce a rejection of the political as such. In a sense, then, in certain forms of subaltern studies, in the very act of enunciating subaltern positionality and declaring solidarity with it, a certain way of articulating the project of subaltern studies, in effect, re-subalternizes the political agency, or the possible political agency of the subaltern. To put this somewhat differently, and I apologize for the abstraction of this phrase I'm about to read, to make the claim that deconstruction is on the side of the subaltern, as Gareth Williams does, whereas hegemony is on the side of domination or elites, is precisely not to deconstruct the binary hegemony subalternity that grounds that claim in the first place. The question of the state, it seems to me, is not only what it has been. Post-colonial studies is, subaltern studies is tied to a kind of larger sense of the post-coloniality of power involved in the construction of modern, colonial roots of the modern state forms. But the question of the state is not only about what it has been and the way it is shaped, and in turn itself been shaped by domination or biopolitical normalization. The question of the state, it seems to me, also involves a transformative future-oriented possibility. It is how the state can function as an agent of social change on behalf of the poor, not just as an agency of domination by the wealthy or powerful. That possibility has a double dimension, it seems to me. How the state itself can be radicalized and modified as a consequence of bringing into it demands, values, experiences from the popular subaltern sectors, and how, in turn, from the state, society itself can be remade in a more redistributed, egalitarian, culturally diverse way. How hegemony might be constructed from the state, in other words. What would it mean to renounce this double possibility? That is, the possibility of transforming the state by bringing into it elements of the region outside of it, and then from the state, using the state as an instrument for changing society. What would it be to renounce that double possibility on the assumption that the state as such, which it seems to me is an essentialist assumption, is wholly bound up with domination and the perpetuation of capitalism, as the quote from Jose Rabasa I read earlier illustrates. Let me pause to consider briefly the case of the Zapatistas. This again leads to a larger discussion. The Zapatistas were one of the social movements that the project of Latin American subaltern studies was most closely aligned with. While they were willing to challenge the state militarily, the Zapatistas, as I think all of you are probably aware, refused, unlike the guerrilla movements of the 1960s and 70s in Latin America, to bid for state power, claiming that the space of their intervention was Mexican civil society. The Zapatistas were also a kind of postmodernist form of social thought, and that they would rule by obeying. That's the Zapatista slogan. I forget how it goes in there. Obedecer, gobernando, obedeciendo. True to that principle, they decided to stay out of the 2006 elections, presidential elections in Mexico, rather than give support to the campaign of the center-left political formation, the PRD, which promised something like a Mexican variant of the Maria Rosada, the pink tide, and which attracted initially, at least, widespread support and expectations. In retrospect, this is a point some of you may take issue with, it seems clear that this decision of the Zapatistas to stay out of the elections, not to support the PRD in the election, contributed, at least in some measure, in a way similar to what happened with the Green Party in the 2000 election in the United States, to the PRD's failure to achieve an electoral majority in Mexico in 2006. The margin of victory of the right-wing party, the PAN, was extremely narrow, less than 1%. It probably involved some voter fraud at that. So it may well be that, as in the Florida results in the 2000, if everybody who voted Green in Florida in 2000 voted instead, or even half of the people that voted Green, or a third of the people that voted Green had voted Democrat, the Democrats would have won the state, and Gore would have won the election, right? So, as in the Florida results in 2000 in the United States, the Zapatista decision not to back the PRD may have contributed materially to its loss. It's not that the Zapatistas wanted the PRD to lose. I think they actually wanted the PRD to win, and then they would be kind of like a left opposition to the PRD. They would point out the contradictions of the PRD program it was promising to delivering. But the result was that the PRD, which had been expected to win, widely expected to win, lost the elections. The Zapatista argument was that it was more important to further radicalize Mexican civil society in the direction of more fundamental change and to encourage people to participate in an election that involved what they considered a flawed reformist party and corrupt, the PRD, and a deeply corrupt and repressive state apparatus. I would argue that there is a double theoretical error in the Zapatista decision to sit out the 2006 elections that's similar to the error represented in the deconstructivist articulation of subaltern studies I've just tried to characterize. One, imagining that the state as such is, because of its historically material ties to colonialism and capitalism, outside by nature of the range of what counts as the subaltern or the poor or the exploited. Two, imagining that civil society is a space clearly separate from the state and electoral politics, and not in seeing your relationship dialectically, the relationship between civil society and the state dialectically. That theoretical error, in turn, also results, in the case of the Zapatistas, in a strategic political error. In other words, errors in theory can have consequences in practice. An era that, in the case of Mexico, was unwittingly complicit with the weakening of the left, the militarization of Mexican society, and the perpetuation of right-wing rule for the near future. Let me move then to the two passages I've selected to comment. So let me try to explain what I think involved with that claim by contrasting these two positions. The first, the Spivak one, is from a 1993 essay by Spivak that represents more or less what I've been calling the deconstructivist articulation of subaltern studies. Spivak is writing here about the subaltern as a kind of limit to the nationalist project of the post-colonial state. Quoting her now. Especially in a critique of metropolitan, here the language problem is Spivak's, not mine. But I think we can get them non-West, kernel. Especially in a critique of metropolitan culture, nationalist, post-colonial critique. The event of political independence of the newly independent nation can be automatically assumed to stand between colony and decolonization as an unexamined good that operates a reversal. But the political goals of the new nation are supposedly determined by a regulative logic derived from the old colony with its interests simply reversed. Secularism, democracy, socialism, nationalist identity, and capitalist development. Whatever the face of this supposition, it must be admitted that there is always a space in the new nation that cannot share in the energy of this reversal. This space has no established agency or traffic with imperialism. Paradoxically, this space is also outside of organized labor, below the attempted reversals of capital logic. Conventionally, this space is described as the habitat of the subproletariat or the subaltern. A fairly famous passage. The second formulation is from an essay by Álvaro García Linera, State Crisis and Popular Power, published in the version I have access to in translation in 2006 by the British journal New Left Review, just after García Linera took office as vice president of the MAS, Movimiento al Socialismo government in Bolivia, which he still is. García Linera writes, the important thing to note about these popular groupings, so this is an essay he writes before he becomes vice president, and in a certain sense, these are trying to articulate in that essay the political program, the political articulation that he lent himself to, that results in the MAS government winning the elections and taking power in Bolivia in 2005, 2006. The The important thing to note about these popular groupings, hitherto excluded from decision-making, and Garcia Linera is referring here to indigenous communities in Bolivia, retirees, the cocalero movement, the coca-growing peasants, unemployed miners, or in Bolivia called relocalizado. Sometimes they go back to being peasants, right, after having been urban workers for, in some cases, generations. Among other social movements in Bolivia. Social movements hitherto excluded from decision-making, is that the demands that they raise immediately seek to modify economic relations. Thus, their recognition as a collective political force necessarily implies a radical transformation of the dominant state form built on the marginalization and atomization of the urban and rural working class. Moreover, and this is a crucial aspect of the current reconfiguration, the leaderships of these new forces are predominantly indigenous and uphold a specific cultural and political project, a specific indigenous, in other words, cultural and political project. In contrast to the period that opened with the 1930s, when the social movements were articulated around a labor unionism that held to the idea of mestizaje, a kind of normative ideal, or racial cultural mixing, and was the result of an economic modernization carried out by business elites. Today, the social movements with the greatest power to interrogate the political order have an indigenous social base and spring from agrarian zones excluded from or marginalized by the process of economic modernization. Spring from agrarian zones excluded or marginalized by the processes of economic modernization. A moment's reflection will suffice, I think, to establish that Spivak and Garcia Linera are talking about exactly the same thing here. Mutatis mutandis, one about India, one about basically the same thing, right? That is, social groups or social strata left out or only partially incorporated by the post-colonial nation states project of modernization and secularization, and in similar ways. For example, the deprivileging of agrarian sectors or peasant sectors of society. Somehow anachronistic. By the way, that's what Gramsci had in mind when he took up the question of the subaltern in the first place, right? What to do with that part of Italy, which was the underdeveloped part of Italy, the south, right? Where basically the mass of the population were peasants, and peasants who were looked down by both the liberal capitalist elites in the north and also by the socialists who saw peasant agriculture as an anachronistic or old-fashioned form of social organization, inevitably reactionary. So both Garcia Linera and Spivak are talking about the subaltern in their respective societies. Yet their arguments in that respect are strikingly different. In Spivak, to recall, the subaltern is a space or habitat that is outside the nationalist articulation of the post-colonial nation state and the sphere of formal politics or trade union struggle. That is, outside of or below hegemony. The subaltern cannot speak, to recall Spivak's famous slogan. The task of the critical intellectual is to represent or read, to use Spivak's own term. Spivak is a literary critic. This constitutive dilemma, the subaltern cannot speak, and to land one's solidarity in what's essentially an ethical gesture. For Garcia Linera, by contrast, the very logic of the demands of the social movements or popular groupings in Bolivia lead them necessarily, that's his phrase, to pose the question of, quoting, a radical transformation of the dominant state form. A logic of the social movements leads them necessarily to pose the question of a radical transformation of the dominant state form. The subaltern, in other words, not only can speak in Garcia Lineda's articulation, it can and should govern. And its government will be a buen gobierno, a good government. I'm alluding here, of course, to the title of Guaman Poma's class at Crónica de Buen Gobierno from the 17th century. Buen gobierno. Garcia Linera invokes in this respect explicitly Gramsci's definition of hegemony as moral and intellectual leadership. I keep coming back to this point because it seems to me that if the humanities is tied up in some kind of way with what I'm talking about here, it's tied up in this question of moral and intellectual leadership. That's, in a way, what the humanities is about. Right? So, quoting Garcia Linera here, the indigenous popular whole should consolidate its hegemony, providing intellectual and moral leadership of the country's social majority. There will be neither electoral triumph nor victorious insurrection without wide-ranging patient work on the unification of social movements and a practical education process to realize the political, moral, cultural, and organizational leadership of these forces over Bolivia's popular and middle strata. The task of traditional intellectuals like us, right? Professors, literary critics, scientists, and Garcia himself is a traditional intellectual. Garcia is not from the popular sectors. He's sort of educated middle class up to that point. Is not to assume, as was the function of the previous ciudad letrada, or lettered city in Latin America, to assume the authority to create intellectual and moral leadership, but rather to lend themselves to a process whose principal articulating agent was not the intelligentsia, but rather the indigenous popular pole. This perspective, Garcia Lineda's perspective, involves a political, rather than, as in Spivak, an ethical relation of solidarity between intellectuals and subaltern social classes and groups. Garcia Linera argues for a new form of politics directed at occupying the institutional space of the state that in some sense comes from the subaltern, but that also involves the participation of intellectuals in theory. Let me an extended parenthesis on that point. In the 1990s, Garcia Linera was a founding member of an academic collective in Bolivia called Comuna, which in many ways resembled the South Asian Subaltern Studies group that Spivak was associated with, and the Latin American Subaltern Studies group that Ileana Rodriguez and I were part of. In 1997, two academics close to Comuna, although I think not formal members of Comuna, Silvia Rivera Cusicanqui and Rosana Barragan, translated and published in Bolivia completely independently of whatever discussion was going on in the United States about subaltern studies, or in Latin American studies about subaltern studies. Published a selection of text from the South Asian Subaltern Studies group, including Spivak's well-known essay, Deconstructing Historiography, under the title Debates Postcoloniales, 1997. Very important book for Bolivian intellectual history. I mentioned this fact, which may seem somewhat arcane. These guys published a collection of essays. Bolivia, 19 because we can assume, since Garcia Linera was part of Comuna, that Garcia Linera probably read and almost certainly knew about this collection. In other words, somehow or another, there's a connection between South Asian Subaltern Studies and Garcia Linera's own evolution as a political and theoretical thinker. That means that subaltern studies may have influenced in some perhaps minor, but nevertheless significant way, the political project represented by the MAS in Bolivia, which is a political project now located within the state apparatus. Oxymoronically then, in the case of Bolivia, subaltern studies has literally become a part of the state. But coming back to my main argument, the contrast between the formulations of Spivak and Garcia Linera, I don't think necessarily comes down to an either-or choice. They could be seen instead to represent different forms of strategic intervention and ideological and theoretical articulation that might be relevant in different spaces or territorialities of activity. Spivak's formulation of subalternity for the work of transnational human rights groups, for example, NGOs, ecological struggles, and the work of what she calls the global humanities. Garcia Linera's for the possibility of hegemonic articulation in a space still conceived more narrowly as national, though not close to international issues. Moreover, the effects of intervention in either sphere need not be antithetical and could instead be mutually reinforcing in some cases. Spivak herself has spoken recently of the necessity or the possibility of reinventing the state. Quoting her, the more geopolitical stuff can work only if in the global south we reinvent the state as an abstract structure, a porous abstract structure, so that states can combine against the deprivations of internationalization through economic restructuring. Nobody looks at the possible efficacy of state structures because people have their faith today in everything outside governments. Remember, I'm not talking about national sovereignty. I'm talking about abstract state structures that are porous. Otherwise, to give accountability solely to non-governmental organizations is also to take power away from citizens who can still, after all, supposedly make the state accountable. Still, I think what Spivak means by reinventing the state here seems quite different than what's entailed in something like the MAS project of winning the national elections and creating a plurinational Bolivian state. Bolivia now defines itself through a constitutional referendum, right? It's un Estado plurinacional. Spivak puts her remarks under the rubric, this is a typical deconstructionist move, of a position without identity, her phrase, including national identity. Citing Spivak. I'm not talking about national sovereignty. I know that something has to be counterposed to the main outpost of power. On the other hand, I'm deeply troubled by identity politics. By contrast, the indigenous popular political bloc imagined by Garcia Linera and in a sense brought to fruition in the electoral bloc represented by the MAS involves at its core questions of cultural and national identity, both at the group level, indigenous cultural affirmation, and at the national level, anti-imperialist nationalists. Spivak's sense of the state as what she calls a porous abstract structure paradoxically ends up leaving the character of the existing state mechanisms intact, simply abstracting them from their immediate context. Whereas the MAS project involves not only the political control of the state by a popular subaltern electoral bloc, but also the possibility of the transformation of the state. I say the possibility of a transformation of the state because the process of the subaltern becoming the state, to recall the phrase from Ernesto Laclau I mentioned at the start, raises both in theory and practice a number of urgent and difficult questions. those of you who are following events in Latin America know that as we speak, there's a significant struggle going on in Bolivia between certain elements within the MAS government in Bolivia and an indigenous group about building a highway through a national park that's part of the territory of an indigenous group that doesn't want the highway built there. So the indigenous group has been protesting, a group which supported, by the way, the MAS project in 2006. There's now a big fight going on between we can talk about before. But that's an example of the kinds of problems that can emerge in this context. In the case of governments like the MAS that have a strong indigenous or Afro-Hispanic component, is there a danger of a fracture between the ethnically or tribally centered social movements which support the state, or initially supported the state, and the broader hegemonic movement precisely around reasons of state? The Bolivian state is claiming that the project of building this road will lead to economic benefits that will benefit everybody, including the indigenous groups that support the MAS government. How can that fracture be avoided or mediated? An inevitable fracture, it seems to me. What happens to the state still marked institutionally by coloniality? You only have to look at Latin American soldiers dressed up in funny uniforms to get a sense of that. As a consequence of subaltern-popular agency within it. What's the place of multiculturalism, or to use the term preferred in Latin America, interculturalidad, in the redefinition of the identity of the nation state? The nation state isn't going to represent one thing, as in the American slogan, the many will become one. You could say the new slogan of the state is the one will become many. So how does that work in relationship? Wasn't the state precisely a mechanism to oppose a kind of unity of identity on what was previously a heterogeneous population? What new constitutional forms of legal and political territoriality are required by something like an Estado plurinacional? What should be the relations of the social movements to the new governments that they help bring to power? Have the social movements captured the state, or are they instead, in a sense, captured by it, limiting the radical force and possibility they carried initially? Such that, to recall Antonio Negri's distinction, they belong to the side of the constituted rather than constituent power. What happens if and when a left government like the MAS government in Bolivia might be voted out of power? Finally, has the possibility of socialism and communism reappeared again after the historical collapse or defeat of the socialist project in the 20th century? Or are the horizons represented by the new governments of the left in Latin America limited to statist, reformist strategies that will respect and leave intact, as Rabas argued in that quote I made earlier, in the last instance, the structure of both national and international market capitalism? And if there is in fact a possibility of a new form of transition to socialism, what then becomes of the famous withering away of the state envisioned by Marx and Engels? We can summarize these questions in the following way, and with this I approach a conclusion. Does the critique of the state in subaltern studies and postmodernist social theory generally rule out in advance the possibility of occupying and transforming the state from a subaltern-popular position? If the answer is yes, that possibility is ruled out, forget about it. The state is essentially an instrument of domination and biopolitical normalization. Then it seems to me two alternatives remain for the kind of work we do in literary and cultural criticism. The first alternative is a neoconservative alternative, and the second is an ultra-leftist now I'm not talking here about real politics. I'm talking about the politics of what we do in our own work, right? But I'm saying there is a kind of neoconservative option you can choose for, you can choose an ultra-left, or at least those are two choices that I think we don't have to make, right? The neoconservative alternative, and I would use as a model for the neoconservative alternative the book by the famous Argentine literary critic Beverly. Some of you who work in Latin American literature may be familiar with Sarro's work. 2005 book, Tiempo de Memoria, kind of a critique of Argentine testimonial narrative and its relationship to the representation of a proceso, the dirty work in Argentina. For me, that book models the basic elements of what I'm going to call a neoconservative position. I'll just mention that. I've written about that elsewhere. But, the neoconservative alternative points in the direction of a re-territorialization of the field of culture, academic disciplinarity, and national identity against what are seen as the debilitating effects of neoliberalism via a strengthening of the state ideological apparatuses, particularly education. An affirmation of national culture, an affirmation of scientific and literary value, a word very important to Sarro, an affirmation of the authority of the academic disciplines. David Stone's critique of Jews testimonial would again be saying that this is anthropology, a professional anthropologist, to show the limits of this kind of testimonial claim. An affirmation of the role of critical intellectuals and professionals. Hegemony implies, in the neoconservative term then, essentially the reassertion of the authority of the educated classes and technical professional intelligentsia in Latin America. That is the contemporary version of what Anquerama called the ciudad negrada. To govern responsibly in the name of the people and in the interest of the nation in globalization. Those professional classes, by the way, are primarily white and European extraction, or white, mestizo. As in the case of some forms of U.S. neoconservatism, I have in mind Daniel Bell here, such a re-territorialization of the authority at the level of the cultural. Remember that the intervention of U.S. neoconservatism is fundamentally an intervention in the narrative of U.S. culture and identity. Right? It's not an intervention, as neoliberalism is, in economic doctrine. Neoconservatives don't care that much about economics. They care about culture, cultural identity. Right? The canon. So, as in the case of some forms of U.S. neoconservatism, such a re-territorialization of authority at the level of the cultural is not necessarily incompatible with a strong Keynesian or redistributive economic policy. Because you could have a combination of neoconservatism and social democracy. Neoconservatism doesn't just fit neoliberalism. In that sense, the neoconservative turn in the form of something like a neo-idealismo, a neo-aerialism, could be, and in fact often is, a component of some of the new governments of the left in Latin America. But that's at the risk of reinscribing or deepening in those governments a line of difference with the subaltern-popular sectors those governments depend on for their support. The neoconservative move, in other words, involves an emphasis on the state and academic authority over the subaltern. The ultra-leftist move, by contrast, is anti-statist and therefore also post-nationalist, like the deconstructive articulation of subaltern studies, with which it has many elements in common. Something like that possibility is represented, of course, by Hardenegri's empire. To recall that by now familiar argument, economic globalization represents a new stage of capitalism with its own special characteristics. In this stage, the nation-state, which had been the territorial form that corresponded to the previous stages of capitalism, mercantile, competitive, monopoly, is now surpassed. The new revolutionary subject, no longer a national subject, the multitude, is therefore necessarily post-national or transnational, hybrid, diasporic. The emergence of the sovereign nation-state in early modernity was already an intrusion on the autonomy of the multitude represented by the medieval commons. Now the power of the multitude will reassert itself. Some of you can hear some of the rhetoric of Occupy Wall Street in these things, right? Indeed, that power, the power of the multitude, is imminent in the very movement of globalization. Hardenegri's manifesto coincides in some ways with the deconstructivist or post-hegemonic articulation of Latin Americanist literary and cultural studies. I have in mind here a book that may just be beginning to come to your attention, or some of you may have already grappled with it, but it's John Beasley Murray's 2010 book. Beasley Murray was also a figure closely associated with the Subaltern Studies project in the 1990s. Post-hegemony, Theory and Politics in Latin America, 2010, University of Minnesota Press. That, I think, is sort of the most articulate expression of what I'm calling this ultra-leftist move in Latin American literary and cultural view. It would seem in reading, say, a book like Cyrus from 2005 and then reading Beasley Murray's post-hegemony that the post-hegemonic articulation of Latin Americanism is exactly the inverse of the neoconservative articulation. Paradoxically, however, both the neoconservative turn and the post-hegemonic turn coincide in expressing a skepticism about or a rejection of the new governments of the pink tide in Latin America. By contrast, in my remarks here, I'm aligning myself in some ways with those governments, not without inevitable doubts and criticisms, but in the hope that they will portend a further process of radicalization. Garcia Linera spoke famously in an address he gave to the Latin American Studies Association in Montreal some years ago, of a state that is not a state. Un estado que deja ser estado. Would this new form of the state continue to be a nation state? That is a state founded on the idea of a certain shared national identity and a contiguous territoriality that is expressive in some sense or another, or contains that identity. The governments of the pink tide are concerned with reasserting national sovereignty. In that sense, they're post-neoliberal. But it's not possible for them to delink the question of sovereignty from, on the one hand, a regional affirmation of Latin America as such, and on the other, from the emergence into those governments of subaltern forces previously marginalized from the identity of the nation. So I don't think it's possible to answer that question definitively, but one thing I think is clear. Nation states will continue to exist and to exercise a certain hegemony over people's lives, but they will do so in radically new ways, which we've only begun to anticipate and understand. To conclude then, let me restate briefly in closing my sense of the paradigm shift in our own work such a perspective entails. To construct the politics of the subaltern under conditions of globalization and in the face of the current crisis of neoliberal hegemony. And I take seriously the fact that we're moving into a new period, right, which is a post-neoliberal period. And that will imply the need for changes in thinking and activity in all kinds of different ways. To do that may require, in some ways, a re-legitimation of the nation state, rather than, as in subaltern studies, a critique of the nation state. Such a process of re-legitimation would also require, however, new concepts of what the nation is, of what national identity is, of what citizenship and democracy are, of the national popular, of hegemony, and perhaps of the nature of politics itself. That is where our roles and responsibilities as students, teachers, and scholars intersect strategically with both residual and emerging social forces in Latin America and the world. Thank you.
I'm sure Charles will either take questions. And are you?
Absolutely.
Do you mind fielding your own questions?
No.
Or would you like?
I could have a question.
Sure.
Or several in one. I do not clearly understand why you keep on always going back to affirming that the subaltern are postmodern as the deconstructivist and the decolonization groups are. What's the need for the subaltern perspective to be related to this kind of postmodern paradigm? That's on one side. On the other side would be what kind of subjects or subjectivities are this kind of new state, of no state, as Garcia Jimenez is referring, in the framework of a plurinational state, right? What kind of subjects and subjectivities are going to be articulated vis-a-vis the subaltern as kind of non-universal or universal, or the subject that at that point became the state. I don't know if it's clear.
I think so, but it's inadequate. My answer is inadequate. So the first question is what's the relationship between subalternity and postmodernity, or postmodernism, maybe. I mean, it's not that the subaltern itself as a vivencia is postmodern, right? I mean, the subaltern simply designates, I mean, the word comes from Gramsci, and Gramsci is writing about, in the 1930s, about the agrarian, underdeveloped part of Italy. In other words, the part of Italy that looks most like Latin America. Okay? So in a way, Gramsci, although he's writing about a European country, is writing about a European country that includes, and Gramsci, by the way, is Sardinian, and Sardinia is a colony of Italy, right? So Gramsci, in some ways, is a post-colonial, anticipating some aspects of post-colonial thought, and he's talking about precisely the underdeveloped region of Italy. So it's a question then of what is the kind of horizon in which the problematic of the subaltern appears as such, right? As a problematic of a political subject that somehow or another is not represented adequately by either the political or the cultural regimes of modernity. And in Latin America, the essential cultural regime of modernity is la ciudad de Grana, right? So this is a subject that is not represented adequately in literature, even where literature makes an effort to transculture or represent the indigenous, the whole problem of indigenismo and so forth. And politically, in the failure of the traditional parties of the left, communist or socialist or nationalist, national populist parties in Latin America, to bring to fruition a project of national transformation that would be generally inclusive of, for example, the indigenous sectors of society. Why? Because they are structured around the notion of economic but also cultural modernization, as Garcia Linera suggests, and ultimately is based on a normative notion of mestizaje and transculturation. Right? We're going to produce a modern subject out of the old indigenous subject. The indigenous subject or the peasant subject as such is anachronistic. We want to produce a modern subject. That modern subject could be a bourgeois liberal subject, the subject of market capitalism, or it could be a socialist subject, the worker, the modern worker. Right? But it'll be a modern subject. So it's only when the crisis of a normative notion of modernity occurs, right? In other words, modernity no longer becomes a normative force, which justifies either capitalism or communism in the Cold War. The Cold War is essentially a battle between two systems, each of which makes a claim to better produce modernity. Communism says we can produce modernity, secularization, through state planning and industrialization faster because we don't have the internal contradictions of capitalism, and the capitalists say, in a way that eventually wins out with neoliberalism, no, the market will be far more effective in producing rapid economic modernization and growth than the kind of planned economy of the Soviet Union. So postmodernism means the crisis, in a sense, of the model of modernity as such, right? And of the historical narratives that are associated with the notion of a normative modernity, including historical narratives of the left, right? Of modernization under left and right. Socialism will complete the process of modernization that capitalism began. So that then becomes a horizon in which the problem of the subaltern is something left out of those narratives or inconveniently situated in relationship to those narratives. Peasants, for example, which still constitute at least half of the population of the world, but you wouldn't know that. Why? Because they're just left out of the narrative of modernization. They're either on the way to immigrating to Juarez or something like that, or they're trapped in some kind of remote past that we don't have much access to. So that's number one. And that was something we understood, by the way, as a point of contact between the South Asian problematic, because that's often raised. How is it that you can take and just adapt in Latin American studies a model that's developed for British ex-colonies in South Asia, which only became independent, right, after the Second World War, whereas Latin America became independent at the beginning of the 19th century. There's continuity here. But one of the things I think we shared was a common sense that a certain model of modernity on which we had structured our own work. The Indians had structured their work, and we had structured our own work in Latin American studies, including, for example, dependency theory and the idealization of boom narrative as a form of cultural transculturation, that those models had entered in crisis, and that crisis, in some sense or another, was designated loosely by what we mean by postmodernity. Okay, that's one. Two, what would this nation state in which no one group had a claim to universality? Is that sort of the idea? The state can no longer be a universal, it stands above.
What kind of subjects would the state require or will be producing in terms of hegemonic?
That's a question. That's a question I don't have an answer. I mean, that's a question I think which is being played out, so to speak, on the ground. But it's being played out, I think, in a much more advanced way in what's going on in Latin America. And I don't mean to minimize the contradictions and fights that are involved in something like the Bolivian Tivnis, that's the name of the regional area that they want to build this road in. Those are really bitter and difficult fights. Garcia Linera, who I sort of champion here, is precisely one of the people under attack, is promoting what's called in Bolivia a Brazilian model. Right? Brazilian model means economic development over anything else. Economic development trumps ecology, it trumps indigenous rights. Not that we're against indigenous rights, but economic development trumps everything. Right? So those are very real fights, but certainly that's a much more advanced fight, right? It seems to me, what's going on in Bolivia, than anything I see in Europe or the United States right now. So I would say Latin America is now, politically at least, representing a kind of direction in which other countries are probably going to move. So what's going to happen in Europe, which has a huge Islamic population, right? You just pretend that it doesn't exist? Or they're all going to become Christian sooner or later? No, obviously Europe has to redefine itself at some point or another as a multinational society that includes. So the German chancellor said, no, there's a failure of multiculturalism. Yes, there was a failure of multiculturalism, because but that doesn't mean that of a kind of multiculturalism, a kind of, but that doesn't mean that the problem of the Islamic community in Europe is going to go away, right? It just needs to be posed in a more radical, Europe has to change its identity as Europe, right? And that's a cultural revolution. That's not something you can change by changing laws. The United States, it seems to me, is in some ways not all that different from Mexico or Bolivia. We're also a post-colonial society. We're also a multinational society. Spanish has been spoken in what's the territorial United States since way before America's appearance as a nation state in 1776, right? The reason we don't have a national language requirement was because a large part of the population of Pennsylvania, state that I work in 1776 spoke German. You would disenfranchise a large number of people if you created English as a national language. So the United States is a multinational nation. It just doesn't recognize itself as a multinational nation. It recognizes itself as the neoconservatives. Samuel Huntington, who's a thinker I like to engage with a lot, has built around the Anglo-Protestant creed, right? You can be part of that. You can be Catholic and come from Italy or from Latin America, but you have to buy into the Anglo-Protestant creed in some way or another if you're going to be American. So what does it mean to imagine the United States as something that isn't structured anymore around the Anglo-Protestant creed? Is that just a kind of chaos? That's the way Huntington thinks about it. Huntington, by the way, came to think in his last years that the main threat to the future of the United States as a nation state was not Islamic fundamentalism or China, but, as I think many of you are aware, Hispanic immigration to the United States, right? Because that would disrupt this organizing force of the Anglo. So I don't have an answer to those problems, but I think subaltern studies was a new way of posing the problem. And I'm just sort of raising the ante a little bit and saying, instead of posing those problems just as problems of theory, maybe we can also pose them as problems of how to construct new types of political projects that involve those issues.
A kind of related question in a certain way. When you were mentioning about this original conceptualization of friendship, the idea of the subaltern as linked to an agrarian past or a rural context, etc. Right. I've been wondering that actually these two terms are continuing, you know, in the theorizations of the subaltern. It seems to be that that's the only way actually to understand the subaltern. So the idea of a suburban, urban subaltern, or someone who is linked in those migratory circles to the city is not conceptualized as well, no, in the idea of the subaltern. And I wondered about this because when you were comparing, for example, Latin America with this rural society of southern Italy, I wonder if we should also take into account the fact that, for example, as a region of Latin America is a region with the fastest pace of urbanization in the world. So that means that pretty soon we're not going to have enough subalterns to theorize about, because most of them are going to be living in the neighborhoods, in the city, in the favelas, so how to theorize then the subalterns when they are already living in the cities, or at least in the margins of the cities?
Well, look, I mean, I don't want to yield to you on the question of peasants, because while there is a big movement and a continuing movement from agricultural sectors into cities and into the United States. I mean, most of the immigration in the United States comes from rural Central America and Mexico, right? Rural Central, not urban Central America. Right? The massive immigration is rural immigration. But still, a lot of people are peasants, right? and they're not disappearing. I mean, what are you anticipating? The peasants are just simply going to be absorbed into the city? So the peasants remain, and they are a problem, right? They've always been a problem in Latin America. They've been a problem from the moment of independence because there were different projects of national formation in Latin America that were more based on peasant egalitarianism. For example, Artigas in the Banda Oriental, right, which is a project to create a new nation state based on distribution of land to egalitarian distribution of land to peasants, rather than the formation of large landed estates and an export-oriented economy. But I don't want to get caught in a sort of essentialist identification of peasants with the subaltern. The subaltern is a flexible, a relational concept, right, which is meant to describe any relationship of subordination or inequality, whether that involves class, caste, age, gender, sexual preference, or any other thing. Any relationship of subordination and discrimination. So the problem with subalternity doesn't go away because peasants become absorbed into the city or urban economies. That's a kind of logic that undergirds certain forms of Latin American cultural studies, like Ernesto Laclau's notion of hybrid cultures. In other words, the subalternity, modernity distinction was a distinction between people still living in an agrarian traditional past and people who now, still being poor working class people, but were now absorbed into the city and whose cultural matrix was now television or popular music or fotonovelas or whatever. So the modernity hegemony, the modernity subalternity distinction as Gramsci understood it. In other words, the difference between a modern working class in northern Italy and a peasant class in southern Italy. This, for somebody like Garcia Conclini or George Udici, simply meant disappears, right? But then what are the new forms of subalternity, it seems to me? That becomes the question. That emerge in the urban world, including movements that are based on questions of gender or sexual identity, where there are issues of inequalities or exploitations or repressions that depend on sexual relations. So the terrain of subalternity is not an essentialist terrain of simply a rural peasantry versus a modernization process. It's the question of what are all the relationships of subordination or dependency in a given society and how those relationships can be reoriented in terms of new ways of thinking about the social. Yeah.
You talked a lot about the political in relation to hegemony, the political sphere. Where do you see consumption filtering or factoring into consensus and hegemony in this radicalization of the state?
Consumption in
the sense of how the way that we consume affects the types of consensus, the nature of consensus that we arrive at. And so really the relation between collective consumption of cultures and even individual consumption and the way that matters for the construction of socioeconomic relations in Latin America and then in terms of globalization in general.
Yeah, no, it's a tough question. I mean, there was a moment in cultural studies, and I'm a person that I sort of lived in my own work a kind of coincidence between subaltern studies and cultural studies. In some ways, for me, those two projects were related because cultural studies was sort of giving to popular subaltern sectors, to popular culture, a kind of validity and agency that my more traditional formation in literary studies, right, in which literature had a sort of normative force, was put into question. I began my career as a student of Spanish Baroque poetry, and in particular the most difficult Spanish Baroque poet, Luis de Góngora. So I don't yield to anyone in terms of literary. But I like Góngora, and I still teach Góngora and Don Quixote and stuff like that. I don't teach popular culture. I teach Góngora, Don Quixote, right? Novela de la Tierra. I teach mainly literature, but I teach it with these new perspectives involved. And one of the perspectives is that the split between literature and popular culture is one of the formative forces in the subalternity hegemony distinction. But you were asking about consumption. So the moment in cultural studies is articulated by Conclini, and I think Conclini is really the most important architect of Latin American cultural studies. I don't always agree with him, but I think he's the most consistent. So Conclini's formula was, el consumo también sirve para pensar. I think consumption is also a way of thinking. In other words, the way people exercise choice, and therefore political agency in some sense or another in the choices they make about what they're going to consume. Now, the neoliberal model of that is you choose whatever pleases you, right? You go into the market and there's that and there's this, and how much do I have to pay for it? Is it really worth that much? Okay. You make a free choice, unmediated by prior hierarchies of choice, right? If you prefer pornography to Shakespeare, for a neoliberal, that's fine. Buy your pornography and pay for it, you know. Shakespeare doesn't necessarily, whereas a neoconservative would say, no, wait a minute, Shakespeare is, we've got to have Shakespeare, you know. Otherwise the country's going to fall apart. So there's a kind of way in which cultural studies fits in with neoliberalism, because it's, okay, let the consumer do what he likes and forget about these hierarchies of authority represented by the academy or literature or good taste or whatever. But on the other hand, that leads to neoliberalism, right, with impoverishment and, you know, all the consequences that have led to the crisis of neoliberalism that we're living in right now. Has led to the tremendous immigration from Latin America to the United States. I mean, the real immigration from Latin America to the United States has been in the last 2 or 3 decades. That's a massive inflow of population. There was immigration before, and it was significant, but this is massive. And that's all the effects of neoliberal reform, for example, on agriculture. Neoliberalism practically destroyed the possibility of a small peasant agriculture, the ejido type system in Mexico. So a new model of consumption is needed, clearly. You can't all have good housing. But where would that come from? And it seems to me that there are some models for that that come out of what we might call pre-modern or pre-capitalist economies. Models of what amount of goods is really necessary, how you have to make a balance, which is sometimes a moral balance between what you can have and what you should have. The Greek idea of oikonomike, right, which is the root of the modern word economics, is the goods that are necessary for the sustenance of the household. What use values do you have to possess that you don't produce yourself that are necessary for your maintaining in an adequate kind of way, in a healthy and prosperous kind of way, your household. Whereas krematistike, right, in Greek political thought, this is Aristotle, right, on economics, is the desire for wealth or goods just for the sake of having them, right? And krematistike is illegitimate for Aristotle, as it is for most pre-capitalist economic formations, because there's no end to it. There's no amount of wealth or goods that you can have that's going to be finally satisfied, because you're not satisfying a need, you're simply... that's a certain sense then in which the questions raised by pre-capitalist or cultures that are at the margin of capitalist development can provide, I think, new models of sustainable growth and distribution of goods. I realize that's an inadequate answer, but somewhere in that direction you'll probably find a better way. Yeah?
This may sound kind of bit out of left field, but it was what you were talking about when you think of it. I was wondering whether we should consider like gangs and drug cartels like the Maracalucha or like Los Zetas that are in Mexico and have recently started crossing the border in Guatemala, whether we should consider them subalterns, and if so, how should we read or understand their use of violence to resist the state?
Yeah, I think that's a good and difficult question, because yes, in some sense or another, obviously, Maracaluchas and narco traffic come out of precisely the subaltern, right, the subaltern population. Their forms of agency. In northern Mexico, we all know that because of the collapse of peasant agriculture, a lot of people move into narco as sort of an alternative form of employment. So you can't establish a nice, convenient boundary line between, so to speak, the good subaltern and the bad. That was always a problem, by the way, because traditionally the subaltern is conceived precisely as an illegitimate form of political agency, right? Banditry, crime,
It's been around
mob
like
consciousness, so
Northern
forth.
Ireland, like the Basques, and it seems like there's maybe some sort of fallacy in that argumentation that I'm not quite sure how to sort out
There's a fallacy in.
the line of thinking that leads voters to choose violent representation.
I don't have any, I mean, yeah, the problem of the subaltern clearly is there. The problem of neoliberalism is clearly there too, right? You didn't have this kind of gang or this kind of large narco traffic before neoliberalism. Right? I'm a 60s person, so I knew there was drugs coming in. But not this. That's a neoliberal phenomenon. That has to do with breaking down the notion that national borders mean anything. That's a deep tenet of neoliberalism. So clearly, in a way, imposing the question of trying to raise the ante of subaltern studies to now include the question of the state, but not just the old state, that was sort of, because it's from the crisis of the old state that the problem of subaltern studies emerges, right? From the postmodern crisis of the state. So you can't just go back to sort of, as I think the government in Mexico is trying to do now, we're just going to reimpose militarily a new order on Mexico. But nevertheless, to deal with those questions, since they do come out of relations of social inequality, you have to sort of, so to speak, address the underlying causes. And I don't see how you can do that through a perpetuation of the very economic mechanism, neoliberal economic mechanisms, which cause those things to get out of hand in the first place. You need some kind of project of planning and regional economic development schemes, economic alternatives and so forth and so on. You need states to say we are going to affirm our national sovereignty, and that means we no longer necessarily have to agree with everything Washington tells us about the war against drugs, which might involve legalization of drugs, or at least decriminalization, right? To sort of decommodify. So that's, I think, where, yes, I think they do have something to do with subalternity, but I also think that the ways of addressing them necessarily have to pass in some kind of way or another through state mechanisms. Yeah. Somebody behind you had their hand up there first. If you don't mind. Yeah. Was it you?
I have to remember my question.
Okay.
All right. Well, speaking of state apparatus, state mechanisms, I'm going back to the case of Bolivia for just a second here. I guess my question to you would be, when we talk about the subaltern becoming the state, or sort of like dwelling within the state in a political sense, that's fine and dandy, I think, but my question to you is, when we talk about that state, what happens to the oppressive apparatus of the state, the apparatus that can actually go into action to carry out, class warfare at a given moment of crisis? I mean, does that just get transformed somehow? Is Is it possible for that state apparatus to just, wither away? Or, I mean, I'm thinking also of specific cases of attempts to dialogue with repressive state apparatus, such as, I mean, even on Wall Street, people are trying to talk to the police. I mean, what happens to those things? Are they transformable?
No, but
I mean,
it's one thing to have Mayor Bloomberg, who's a big capitalist, right, and billionaire, kicking out Occupy Wall Street people, and it's another thing to have the government of Bolivia saying to the big capitalists in Santa Cruz, the energy resources that you have in Santa Cruz belong to the nation as a whole, and if you don't like it, we're going to send the army there to make sure that's the case, right? So in each case, the instrument of force is the same and probably has the same police mentality, right? Of, okay, we're told to do this and we're going to beat some people up, and but that's, I think, where the form content question sort of comes in. Is the content, is the form of the police the problem, or is the content of what they do the problem? If the state, let's say, when the Haitian Revolution happens, a state is formed, right? A new state is formed, with its own army, police, laws, constitution, corruption, et cetera, right? And the contradiction between the new Haitian state and the population of slaves, former slaves, that so to speak, brought that state into being, is a real one, and probably the main contradiction in modern Haitian history, right? Still present in Haitian history. But without the Haitian Revolution becoming the state, in other words, without the slave rebellion taking the form of a nation state, slavery wouldn't have ended. The state, the formation of the Haitian revolutionary state, makes the ending of slavery possible. Otherwise, slave rebellions, as is well known by historians of slavery, right, end up simply being re-territorialized, right? The rebellion happens, it creates a territoriality, but since the territoriality isn't a nation state, sooner or later, some combination of forces, British, American, Latin American, combine to reoccupy that territory and reimpose slavery. It's only by becoming an independent nation state that the slave rebellion could end in a definitive kind of way slavery. So, yeah, no, the nature of the forces doesn't change, but I think the content of what the forces do. Now, in the long run, what happens? Do you have a nicer police or something like that? More directly tied to the people? I don't think that's a metaphysical question. I think that's a question every neighborhood, especially every poor neighborhood in the United States faces, Couldn't we have a police that was more deeply rooted in the community itself, represented the interests of the community, was not some kind of external force imposed on the community, but rather a force that could articulate and negotiate and mediate tensions within the communities itself. That's as close as whatever the neighborhoods are around Ohio State University. Yeah.
Okay, so
You remembered your question.
So, Sarah, how about one? Because Dr. Beverley has very graciously agreed to join us in less institutional, more popular setting. How about, something short and normal conversation?
Three short ones.
Okay, so one of them is about the faith in nation states,
Yeah.
and that idea versus the idea of just getting rid of the borders. And I'm concerned about how you're talking, maybe something that reinvents the nation state over and over again, which is something that obviously stops bodies from crossing, but not corporations. So already, the things that cross in the service of capitalism can cross. The things that can't are the things that are being bottlenecked and forced into servitude. So, recreating that system, I'm not sure is a great idea.
Right.
I'll just ask that question to these sites, and am I following one of the materialism cultures to do?
I'm sure they're related. I think the hard and angry argument has a lot to be said for it. that the nation state has been transcended as a, and that was always a sort of impulse within the anarchist and the Marxist movement itself, to be against, to think in terms of, because the nation state was seen as sort of the formal embodiment of capitalist rule. I mean, the essential organizing principle of the nation state is to create an internal market, and then to police the frontiers so that you have sovereignty, right, over all economic activity within a given space. And that creation of the market, if you recall the argument in Capital, right, is one of the preconditions for the emergence of capitalist industry as such, because without a dense, protected internal market, you can't have the kind of scales of production that capitalist industry on a large scale requires. So there's that sense of a sort of intimate connection between the form of capitalism itself, modern capitalism, and the form of the nation state. And what Hart and Negri are saying is that with globalization, with economic globalization, that connection is broken. Capitalism no longer regards the nation state as really functional for its purposes, and therefore the left also has to move into a framework that's beyond the nation state. My sense is that there's something to that, but there's a little bit of, it's like reading science fiction. You know? Yeah, science fiction always sort of takes something that's in the present, but it sort of projects it to its ultimate possible consequences, and that's my feeling about the post-national kind of argument. It still seems that there's a lot that has to be played out at the level of the nation state, beginning with, but then this is, again, something that could be put into question, the question of hegemony itself. Is there a space of hegemony, moral and intellectual leadership, right, that's independent of the nation state? I mean, you could talk about global human rights, and but global human rights is not exactly the same thing as hegemony in the sense it doesn't have any political consequences, right? I mean, how can you translate, unless you have something like a world government in which the program of something like global human rights would be a program that you were advocating to hegemonize that global government. So hegemony, it seems to me, still necessarily exists at the level of the nation state, and vice versa. The nation state is itself, in some sense or another, a product of hegemony, an imagined community, to recall Benedict Anderson's phrase.
Well, I hope many of you learned